It feels like things are pretty shaky in the world of economics right now. We've seen trillions wiped out on Wall Street, and then Hong Kong's market saw its biggest drop in decades, I think something like 13%. And a lot of folks are pointing at President Trump's tariffs. Like that's kind of the thing that kicked all this off.
Yeah, it's hard to not see these market movements as like connected, right? The uncertainty, the potential for disruption, all that's tied to the tariffs. It feels like that's really sending shockwaves through the whole global system.
So for this deep dive, we're going to tackle the tariffs head on. Like, what are the real-world impacts of what President Trump is doing? We've got news reports, analyses from economics professors. We've even got some insights from financial analysts to help us make sense of it all.
Yeah. And this is for everyone listening, whether you're like a hardcore economics buff or you just, you want to understand what you're seeing in the headlines. Our goal is to cut through the jargon and highlight what's really important. What are the key things to understand? Maybe even uncover some surprising consequences that people haven't really thought about.
Exactly. We're creating a clear path for you to understand what these tariffs might actually mean for countries that are already struggling, for American workers, and for the entire future of international trade. All that without getting lost in like the super technical weeds.
One of the things that really jumps out when you look at all these different sources is the range of reactions. Some economists are like really concerned. I mean, they use words like stupidity and cruelty to describe these policies, while others are like, okay, what is Trump really trying to achieve here? What's the strategy?
And the concerns are big. Like people are talking about a global recession being more likely now, about trade wars between countries escalating, even about the possibility of like currencies changing how they work, and the whole global economic order shifting. So let's jump in. Okay, so Richard Wolff, he doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture of the American economy, right?
And it's important to remember he's coming at this with a critical view of capitalism, so that shapes his whole analysis.
Right, and one of the core issues he talks about is this big redistribution of wealth over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
He's not just saying the rich are getting richer. He's describing a massive shift of wealth and income from the bottom and the middle, all going to the top. Even names like Gates, Buffett, Musk, Bezos, the usual suspects.
Yeah, that concentration of wealth. It's huge. And he connects it directly to the decline of the American middle class.
Which is, I guess, what the U.S. was known for, right?
Right, that large, relatively well-off middle class, that was the American identity. And as that's eroded, it's had some serious societal consequences.
Yeah, then we've got this inequality fueled by wealth redistribution, a struggling middle class, and then he drops the debt bomb.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not just one type of debt, it's governments, corporations, households, all at record levels. Like everyone's just borrowing like crazy, and it just doesn't seem sustainable.
The numbers are really scary.
Like what kind of numbers?
Well, he says government debt's around $35 trillion, compared to a GDP of, what, around $25 trillion? And that's during peacetime, which is pretty wild. And then corporate debt is also at a record high. He says something like 20% of corporations are what he calls zombie corporations.
Zombie corporations.
Yeah, they're barely making enough profit to cover their debt payments. So they can't invest, they can't grow.
Oh, so they're just kind of exist.
Exactly. And it shows how fragile the corporate sector is right now.
And it's not just mortgages for households anymore. He talks about all this car loan debt, credit card debts through the roof, and then student loan debt. That's just crushing people.
Right.
And he makes this point that, unlike in the past, a bachelor's degree, it doesn't guarantee a good job anymore. It doesn't guarantee a better future. Not like it used to.
So you're saddled with all this debt, but there's no guarantee of a payoff.
Yeah, it's like the old rules don't apply anymore.
It's a different economic reality.
Okay, so we've got inequality, debt, and then Wolff goes even bigger, right? He says this economic situation is tied to something even bigger, the decline of the American empire.
He does, doesn't he? That's a pretty bold claim. But he backs it up with some interesting observations.
Like what?
Well, he talks about how the U.S. share of global exports and imports has been shrinking. The dollar isn't as dominant as it used to be.
And that shift away from the dollar. He says central banks are putting their money in other currencies now, like the Japanese yen, the euro, the Chinese yuan, even gold.
Yeah, he points out that gold prices have gone up quite a bit, which might be a sign of that trend.
It's like everyone's looking for alternatives.
Right, and Wolff really emphasizes this link between a strong economy and global power. He says a weak economy at home weakens you globally, and as your power fades, it hurts your economy even more. It's this vicious cycle.
And then he makes this point about denial. Like, no one in the U.S. wants to admit that this is happening.
No one wants to talk about the decline.
Yeah, it's like everyone's pretending things are fine.
And he says that's stopping any serious discussion about what needs to change. He even noticed it during the last election, how no one was talking about the decline. It has been to demand more from our allies. Canada, Mexico, we're putting pressure on them, threatening tariffs, that kind of thing.
So we're squeezing our friends.
It seems that way. And he sees it as a sign of a society under stress.
Yeah, it doesn't sound good.
Yep.
But then he kind of shifts gears, right? He talks about the history of capitalism, how even the early guys...
Like Adam Smith, David Ricardo.
Yeah, they had some concerns about how things could go wrong.
They did. It's important to remember that. People talk about free markets, but they forget these early economists weren't totally gung-ho about it. They had worries. Well, they were worried about rent-seeking, which is basically getting rich without actually producing anything. They were worried about oligarchy, where a small group controls all the power. They even said the government should invest in things like infrastructure, and they knew that capitalism could lead to inequality and exploitation.
So it's not like they were blind to the problems.
No, not at all. But it seems like a lot of those warnings have been forgotten or ignored in how we think about free markets today.
Like we cherry-picked the parts that we liked and left out the rest.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, so all this sets the stage for tariffs. They've become a big part of U.S. economic policy lately, especially under Trump.
Right.
The idea was that tariffs would bring back manufacturing jobs and help us renegotiate those trade deals.
But Wolf is really skeptical about whether they can actually do that.
He is.
Big time. He points out that this promise of bringing back manufacturing, it's not new. He says 11 presidents before Trump said the same thing, and it never worked. Basically saying the odds are against Trump.
He doesn't think he can pull it off.
And he even suggests that a lot of what Trump does, including these tariffs, is just for show.
Like it's all for the cameras.
Yeah, political theater is what he calls it. He wants to excite his base, He gives this example of firing federal employees. Like, yeah, maybe that sounds good, but most government jobs are at the state and local level, so it doesn't really make a dent.
It's all about the image.
Right. And then he talks about how complex the global economy is now. Like, it's not just simple anymore. He uses the car industry as an example.
Oh, yeah. Cars are made all over the place now.
Exactly. With NAFTA and all these agreements, car parts cross borders multiple times before the car is even assembled. So when you slap tariffs on, it just adds costs at every step, and the cars end up more expensive for everyone.
It backfires.
And then there's the whole issue of Mexico.
Right.
He says if you crack down on immigration from Mexico and then you add tariffs on Mexican goods...
You're just going to devastate their economy.
Exactly. And that could lead to even more people trying to leave Mexico to find work. So it could actually make the immigration problem worse.
Oh, wow.
It's all connected, you see. And he talks about how businesses don't trust these tariffs. They don't want to make big decisions like moving factories back to the U.S. when they don't know if the rules are going to change next week.
Right, they need some stability.
Exactly. That uncertainty actually discourages investment.
It's the opposite of what they're trying to do.
And then there was that whole thing with TikTok.
Oh, right.
Trump was saying he might ease up on tariffs with China if they made a deal on TikTok. So is China really this big enemy we need to fight with tariffs, or are they just a bargaining chip? He thinks all this uncertainty is going to lead to a recession.
A recession.
Yeah, he says businesses are too scared to invest. And after 40 years of, financialization and globalization, it's not like companies can just pick up and move back to the U.S. It's not that easy. What happens when other countries start putting tariffs on U.S. goods?
Oh, yeah.
He says Europe, Canada, Mexico, Asia, they're all going to hit back. And that's going to hurt U.S. businesses and consumers. He thinks the U.S. doesn't get that the world has changed, that China and those BRICS countries are serious economic players now.
Tough. What's the impact on the world's poorest countries?
So Professor Jayati Ghosh from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she has a really sharp critique here, especially when you look at the impact on developing countries, and she doesn't mince words. She talks about the potential for serious harm.
The point here is that these tariffs are being imposed without any real understanding of the economic realities on the ground in these vulnerable places.
Exactly. You've got countries in South Asia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all struggling with debt, access to foreign currency, debt repayment obligations, huge burdens, right? And then these tariffs come in, targeting some of their most important export markets, like the U.S.
And it's hitting the garment exporting countries especially hard. Bangladesh, Laos, Cambodia, like those industries are often the first step for developing nations to build their economies. They create jobs, bring in foreign currency, give them a way to be a part of global trade. But we're talking about industries that are labor-intensive. It's not like the U.S. is rushing to bring those jobs back home, so it's really cutting off a lifeline.
Totally. And these garment sectors employ tons of people, especially women. We're already seeing orders being canceled,
Right.
and there's this looming threat of mass layoffs. We could be talking about hundreds of thousands, even millions of jobs lost in economies that are already so delicate.
It really makes you wonder what the thinking is behind these tariffs. Ghosh even says, like, there doesn't seem to be a clear goal. It feels more like they're just throwing a blanket over everything without looking at the specific details and the consequences for each country.
Right. And the negative ripple effects aren't going to stay contained. Ghosh is worried about a global recession because the uncertainty, the canceled orders, the reluctance to invest, it creates this climate of fear that can hurt even countries with lower tariffs, like Nepal, for example.
But she does bring up one potential upside. It's interesting. She suggests that this whole disruption could actually push developing countries to rethink things, to depend less on exports and build up their own domestic markets, maybe find more sustainable ways to produce things. So we zoom out, maybe this could be like a catalyst, for a change in how development works. More focus on internal resilience, less on chasing external demand.
That's an intriguing thought. A potential silver lining, maybe. Well, Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, he's pretty straight-talking. He calls these tariffs pure protectionism, and he puts it down to President Trump just misunderstanding trade deficits. For our listeners, a trade deficit just means a country imports more than it exports. And Sachs is saying that's not always a bad thing or a sign of unfairness.
Right. It's not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself.
Yeah. Sachs argues that Trump's got this idea that these deficits mean other countries are cheating, when it's actually more about America's own spending habits and budget deficits.
He also stresses that this isn't like a universal agreement in the U.S. It's not like the whole Republican Party is behind this, or Congress, or even the business community. He sees it as a pretty big failure of the political system. Like one person with what he sees as flawed ideas can make these huge sweeping changes.
He even uses terms like a corrupted political system and talks about how executive power is being used too much through these emergency declarations.
He also mentions how the business community, they were initially supportive of Trump, mostly because of the tax cuts. But that support might be fading as the potential damage from the tariffs becomes more obvious. Sachs even thinks there might be legal challenges, arguing that maybe the emergency declarations aren't even legally sound. And Radhika Desai, she builds on that whole idea of political motivations. But she's got a different, maybe even more critical perspective on why these tariffs are happening.
Yeah, she does. She sees Trump as a morbid symptom more than anything else, like a symptom of a system that's run out of ideas, not necessarily someone with a grand plan. And she thinks this focus on China and trade, it's a distraction to take the heat off bigger problems like what she calls horrific neoliberal policies that have been around for ages in the U.S.
And despite all the noise and drama about the tariffs, Desai thinks they might not last. She believes the economic pressure from capitalist interests in the U.S., that'll eventually force things to change. Like, either the policies get modified or they get rolled back completely. It makes you wonder, are these tariffs really meant to reshape the global economy? Or are they more like a political play with a limited shelf life?
Yeah. Well, Sachs is worried about a potential domino effect. If other countries hit back with their own tariffs, he thinks we could see a full-blown trade war, like what happened with the Smoot-Hawley tariff back in the 1930s, which contributed to the Great Depression.
That's a scary thought.
It is. But he does offer another possibility, a more optimistic one. He thinks other nations might just decide to go around the U.S., create their own open trade agreements, which could actually strengthen regional partnerships. He points to the growing diplomacy between China, Japan, and Korea, and the better relationship between China and India as signs that this is already happening, like a potential reshuffling of global alliances.
The U.S. dollar isn't acting like a safe haven anymore. Usually when there's economic uncertainty, the dollar goes up. But this time it's going down.
It's kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah. He puts it down to a loss of confidence globally. Confidence in the U.S. economy, confidence in U.S. leadership, even confidence in the dollar itself long term. But he says the dollar's dominance was already on a slow decline before these tariffs.
Right. And there are a few reasons for that. The rising power of other economies, China, India, and so on. Also, new technologies and payment systems that might not need the dollar anymore. And then there's the U.S. itself. using the dollar as a weapon through sanctions.
That's definitely been a tactic. The U.S. using its economic muscle, like freezing assets, imposing secondary sanctions. And Sachs says this is pushing countries to find alternatives.
Yeah.
Like the BRICS nation. They're looking at ways to do international payments without relying on the dollar. And that's a big geopolitical shift. The U.S. has had this huge advantage with the dollar being the main reserve currency. It's made borrowing easier and given them leverage in foreign policy. But those advantages start to disappear if there are multiple currencies in play.
Desai talks about that too, the idea of a weakening U.S. imperial power. And she says America's coercive tactics, like the sticks they use, they're becoming less effective compared to China's carrots, like the offers of economic partnerships. She thinks European nations and other Western allies might end up banding together, not because they love the U.S., but because they want to hold on to their own power as the U.S. loses influence. Paul Krugman, he won the Nobel Prize in economics. And he doesn't hold back. He says these tariffs, they could end up being even higher than the Smoot-Hawley tariffs from the Great Depression. And they're hitting a U.S. economy that's way more connected to the world today. So the potential damage is enormous. And the uncertainty, that's the killer. Businesses don't know what's going to happen next with these tariffs. It makes planning and investing nearly impossible.
It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. And Krugman, he questions this whole idea of using tariffs to reshape the global economy in favor of the U.S. He says trade imbalances, those deficits, they often happen because of how money moves around for investment, not necessarily because other countries are being unfair. He makes this analogy to how you might have a surplus with your employer and a deficit with your local supermarket. It's just part of how economies work.
It's normal give and take.
Right. And he thinks maybe Trump is just obsessed with tariffs. Like the goal is the tariffs themselves, and then they figure out the reasons later. He stresses that tariffs always make things worse economically. Prices of imports go up, the amount of imports goes down, it hits GDP, investment, the whole 9 yards. And here's an interesting thing. He's changed his mind about how tariffs cause recessions. He used to think it was mainly the direct economic impact. But now he believes the uncertainty is the biggest danger. Businesses get spooked, they stop investing, and that's what can tip things into a recession.
Makes sense.
Krugman says all this talk about American exceptionalism sounds pretty outdated now, especially when you look at other things going on, like cuts to science funding. He also mentions the possibility of China fighting back by devaluing its currency, the renminbi. But he acknowledges that China has its own economic problems to deal with. In the end, Krugman thinks Congress needs to take back control over trade policy from the president as a way to prevent these damaging unilateral moves.
Right, Dalio?
So Dalio agrees. There are big economic imbalances, the way capital flows, trade flows, and U.S. manufacturing is definitely struggling. But he's not convinced tariffs are the right answer. He asks, how are tariffs going to fix the deeper structural problems in the U.S., like the fact that a big chunk of the population has low literacy levels, which affects productivity?
So the tariffs are more like a Band-Aid on a deeper wound.
That's the worry. He thinks they'll just disrupt the system even more, like sand in the gears of production worldwide. He sees problems in capital markets, costs going up for businesses, revenues going down, and he doesn't like the political side of this either. These policies are happening at a time when the U.S. already has huge budget deficits, which just makes the whole economic picture even more complicated. So are tariffs actually a good way to tackle America's economic problems? Or are they just going to make things worse and create new problems? Okay, CGTN, what do they have to say?
They really highlight the immediate negative reaction in Asian markets after Trump's latest tariff announcement. They call it a bloodbath. Major markets in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Australia, Tokyo's Nikkei, Singapore, they all saw big drops right after the announcement. Their view is that Trump has started a trade war, and it's caused this loss of confidence. The opposite of what he said he wanted to do, make America stronger.
It's backfiring.
That's the argument. They say the U.S. economy is so entangled in global supply chains now that it can't just isolate itself. And in the end, American consumers are going to be the ones paying the price. They say Trump's claims about long-term benefits are just a bluff, and they think his main goal is to promote himself and cause chaos. They point to how trillions of dollars vanished from U.S. stock markets as proof of what's happening, and they even bring up the possibility of a major economic downturn, like a recession day or even a new Great Depression.
Whoa, that's a pretty dire prediction.
It is. They draw parallels to past economic crises, like when emergency plans were put in place. And they also call out what they see as contradictions in what the U.S. Treasury Secretary is saying about who actually pays for the tariffs. You know, like passing the buck.
Right, avoiding responsibility.
Exactly. And there are estimates in the CGTN report that say these tariffs could add thousands of dollars to the yearly expenses of an average American household. They also point out that the global economy is different now. It's in a low inflation state. Disinflation. So these tariffs could hurt a lot more than they did when Trump first used them. And finally, they warned that this could be a big political risk for Trump. If regular Americans start feeling the pain, any support he had could disappear quickly. Now, for some very pointed warnings from economist Michael Hudson.
Okay, let's hear what Hudson has to say.
He's really sounding the alarm. He says Trump wants two things. He wants to shrink the U.S. trade deficit, and he wants to keep the U.S. dollar as the top global currency. And Hudson says those two goals are completely at odds with each other. In fact, they could cause a huge global crisis. He explains that for other countries to use U.S. dollars for trade and to pay off debts, the U.S. has to have a trade deficit. That's how those dollars get out into the world. So if the U.S. tries to shrink the deficit with tariffs, it'll choke off the supply of dollars.
So it's like cutting off the oxygen.
Yeah. And Hudson says that could trigger a debt crisis, especially in countries like Canada and Mexico. Their currencies could weaken against the dollar, making their dollar debts a lot harder to pay back. He sees Trump's approach as this win-win is a loss kind of thing, like the U.S. can only win if other countries lose. And he thinks that destroys any chance of having trade relationships that actually benefit everyone involved. He also brings up this irony, historically the U.S. used protectionist policies to develop its own economy, but now they're trying to stop other countries from doing the same thing.
That's an interesting point, a double standard.
Yeah. And Hudson says Trump is using finance and trade as weapons now, like warfare by other means, because traditional military intervention is becoming less and less effective. But he thinks these tactics are going to backfire on the U.S. More inflation, trouble with reindustrialization, less investment in research and development because companies are losing export profits. He gives the example of Mexico, how remittances, the money sent back by Mexican workers in the U.S., plays a huge role in supporting the Mexican peso, and U.S. tariffs could disrupt that flow. Hudson says they could either go through extreme austerity, or they might have to default on their debts. And neither option is good, plus the U.S. might retaliate, with sanctions or even seizing assets. But he does offer a glimmer of hope. He thinks all this could be a wake-up call for the rest of the world. Like maybe it's time to find alternatives to the U.S. dollar, to create a system that isn't so dominated by the U.S. And he contrasts this with China's approach to international economics, which is more about mutual benefit, win-win, as they call it, versus Trump's more confrontational style.
It's a clash of philosophies.
Totally. Hudson also keeps bringing up these contradictions in Trump's thinking. He hates neocons, but then he appoints them to key positions. He wants a strong dollar, but he also wants to bring back manufacturing. And Hudson explains why weakening the dollar might not even help with reindustrialization, because the U.S. is so deindustrialized already and so reliant on imports. It could just lead to more inflation, his prediction.
Yeah.
More inflation in the U.S., companies laying off workers, and the world moving away from reliance on America. He even floats this idea that the U.S. might start confiscating foreign investments, like what happened with TikTok. And he points to historical precedents for the U.S. doing things like that.
That would be a drastic move.
It would. And finally, Hudson suggests that other countries might just call Trump's bluff, refuse to lower their export prices even with the tariffs, maybe even slap on their own export charges to get a cut of the revenue.
So basically fighting fire with fire.
Yeah, which could lead to this spiral of economic conflict.
Picture, yeah. And I think one of the most interesting points that Professor Desai makes right off the bat is how she frames Trump. She sees him more as a morbid symptom.
Yep.
Her argument is if we just focus on Trump and his proposed tariffs and his actions, we might miss this much larger internal crisis that's happening within the U.S. economy, society, politics, its culture, and even its standing on the world stage.
All the anxieties and frustrations, that kind of propelled Trump into power in the first place.
Yeah.
It's not just about him. It's not just about, one person.
Right.
It reflects a deeper unease within the whole U.S. system itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And this perspective, I think, really helps us understand some of the seemingly contradictory aspects of U.S. foreign policy,
Yeah, okay.
For instance, Desai points to the surprising continuity between Trump's and Biden's approaches.
Despite the differences in personality, right?
Yeah.
And how they talk about things.
The rhetoric.
The rhetoric, there does seem to be this consistent underlying approach to these really key global challenges.
Yeah.
And it really underlines her point about the declining imperial power of the U.S. It's really striking. When she makes this comparison of the U.S. having this miserable jalopy full of sticks,
Yeah.
right, meaning like coercion and sanctions, versus China, who's got this like huge cartload of carrots.
The carrots and sticks analogy.
Yeah, the carrots being economic incentives and opportunities.
Yeah, and I think what's powerful about that comparison is that it really highlights the inability of the U.S. to offer that same level of economic inducement as China,
Right.
and that really weakens their global influence, and that in turn kind of forces these traditional allies like European nations, Japan, who still want to maintain their own forms of capitalism, their own sort of international power.
Right.
It almost forces them to align more closely with the U.S. Even if they're irritated by Trump's methods. It's almost like a marriage of necessity, given how the global landscape is shifting.
Right. Yeah. So we've got what does Desai have to say about this?
Yeah, she's pretty skeptical about how effective tariffs will be in actually fixing the U.S. economy. I think a key part of her analysis is that while Trump's making a lot of noise about tariffs, she even uses the word brouhaha, they're likely to be inflationary, and ultimately hurt American workers and businesses.
Right.
And on top of that, she anticipates some pretty significant domestic pushback from capitalists and lobbyists, people who are really going to feel the negative effects of these widespread tariffs.
So if Desai is so critical of tariffs as this economic, cure-all,
right,
why is Trump emphasizing them so much?
Yeah, she argues that it's primarily about appealing to his electoral base. It's about blaming external factors like China and trade for the U.S.'s economic problems, rather than addressing the deeper, more systemic issues that stem from decades of what we often call neoliberal policies.
Right.
Like a focus on free markets and reduced government intervention.
Right. So it's kind of like a convenient scapegoat.
Yeah, it's a way to kind of deflect responsibility.
Exactly.
Earlier.
Yeah.
About the U.S.'s declining, power on the international stage.
Absolutely.
So
how do they react to all this?
Yeah.
How are they going to react to Trump's, proposed tariff hikes?
Yeah. Desai talks about the responses from traditional U.S. allies like Canada and European countries, and their primary desire, as she sees it, is a return to the status quo ante. A commitment to NATO.
Right.
But she argues that while these leaders, they might publicly, express patriotic opposition to Trump's policies, their economies are so deeply intertwined with the U.S. that it really limits their ability to maneuver.
It's a real balancing act.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
They gotta play the game, right? But also protect their own interests.
Right.
Okay.
She kind of characterizes them as economically stagnant compared to, the rise of competitive imperialism back in like the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Right.
And she emphasizes their increased dependence on the U.S. and this lack of viable alternatives in terms of production and capital markets. And this dependency, it makes their opposition to U.S. policies kind of muted.
Yeah.
And impact of Trump's threats of secondary sanctions on countries that are buying oil from Russia and Venezuela.
Okay.
And
Western perspective, which has often focused on, removing restrictions for capital penetration.
Right. Sort of like a free flow of capital, unfettered movement of capital with China's approach.
Okay.
Which emphasizes mutually beneficial agreements and respecting national economic policies.
Right. So China's approach is more about like cooperation.
Yeah, and mutual benefit over just this sort of unfettered movement of Western capital.
Right.
And she suggests that the world might increasingly look towards China's model of globalization.
Wow.
Right. Sobering prediction. And it's interesting. She thinks that the U.S. dollar system might actually crash.
Why?
Before viable alternatives fully emerge.
Okay.
She talks about the Triffin dilemma.
Okay.
which is this core problem for any global reserve currency,
Mm-hmm.
where the need to supply the world with currency
Yeah.
eventually undermines confidence in that currency itself.
Right.
And the expansion of dollar-denominated financial activity,
Mhm.
that's been an attempt to counteract this.
Right.
But-
Not an immediate replacement for the dollar on the horizon.
Right.
What does she see happening?
Yeah, so she discusses the limitations of bilateral payment systems and currency agreements, as replacements for the dollar. But then she introduces this idea of a second-tier currency
Okay.
that's used just for central bank settlements.
Right.
And this is something that's kind of akin to, Keynes's proposals
Mhm.
for an international clearing union.
Okay.
But she emphasizes that a system like that
Yeah.
would likely require capital controls
Okay.
to function effectively. And that's a pretty significant departure
It is. Yeah.
from the current free flow of capital that
Yeah.
we see happening. So it's a complex idea, but
Yeah.
it really highlights the potential for major shifts in how global finance operates. And then she also talks about reindustrialization, this idea that's been, floating around.
Mm-hmm.
She's pretty clear that tariffs alone won't bring that about.
All right.
Like, you need a real industrial policy
Yeah.
with state intervention.
Mm.
But he sees that as unlikely under the current political and economic climate.
Yeah.
And she also raises some practical obstacles to reindustrialization,
Right.
right? Like the availability of skilled labor,
Right.
the declining state of the U.S. education system.
Yeah. Those are real issues
Yeah.
that need to be addressed. So after this deep dive into the impact of Trump's tariffs, what are the big takeaways?
Well, we've seen a pretty complicated picture emerge. These tariffs, they're meant to help the U.S. economy, but they come with a lot of risks. They could be devastating for the poorest countries. They could trigger a global recession and a whole bunch of trade wars. And they're creating huge uncertainty for businesses everywhere. On top of that, the dollar's position as the world's leading currency could weaken. And a lot of experts think these policies are based on flawed economic ideas and driven by domestic politics.
It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And we've heard a wide range of views from the experts. Some are strongly against these policies, while others are trying to understand why Trump is doing this. But the one thing everyone seems to agree on is that the stakes are really high, and these actions could reshape the global economy in a big way.
So for our listeners, after hearing all this, what do you think the future holds for the global economy? We've seen these deep contradictions, these potential unintended consequences. What kind of new order might emerge from this upheaval? It's a big question to think about. And we encourage you to consider the viewpoints of different countries and whether the current path is sustainable.
It's a conversation that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Until next time.